Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Liberty Dispatch. It is great to see you again. My sincere apologies. It has been quite the start to 2026. On a personal note, a very good start with the business, with church stuff, but my responsibilities in those areas as well as at home have really made it difficult for me as a solo man to bring you Liberty Dispatch episodes. But thankfully, in God's providence, we have a back catalog of terrific interviews that we have not released in their entirety to you. And while we were going to put that behind the paywall, instead of doing that, I want to give you all of these interviews that Andrew and I had the pleasure of doing for our 350th episode, I should say. I want to give you them free of charge. We've also slashed all our support tiers on Substack in half, so it's easier to support the program for less than a coffee at Starbucks would cost you. You can support us on a monthly basis to help continue to bring you content. We will have some content moving forward. Do not despair. I'm working on things, but it's just been a little bit slower than I expected at the start of this year. But we are going to be doing some great stuff. We're going to be doing some deep dives into Mark Carney, who he is, what his worldview is all about, and why that matters to Canadians at this moment. We're going to talk about economics, the state of finances in Canada, because that is really, really, really the key issue nowadays, apart from obviously the spiritual apostasy going on in our nation. So we're going to actually hone in on worldview, spiritual apostasy, and also the thing that is most worrisome to Canadians, which is the state of economic affairs in Canada. So those three things are going to be right on the top of the to-do list. We're going to have some help from our friends over at Rocklinc, which this episode and all our episodes are sponsored by. Jonathan Wellham will be coming on the show. He'll be giving us his professional opinion on the state of the economy, and we'll be dissecting a bunch of things. So just stay tuned for that. I apologize that this year has been a little bit crazy to begin with, but I want to give you now a wonderful interview that Andrew and I were able to have with Pastor Doug Wilson, friend of the show, on whether to Christian nationalism or not. That is the question. And that is the question that we posed to Doug in this interview. I know you'll enjoy it. I know you will. So please stay tuned and also share this out as far as you can with so many other people, because that helps us boost our content and get this type of content out to more people. Because I actually think we cover things in this episode in a way that I don't think I've heard Doug speak on yet. So it's a very interesting glimpse into the discussion on Christian nationalism and how Christians are to relate to the state and everything. And I know it's just filled with, as most interviews with Doug, just tons of good biblical wisdom that I know you will appreciate. So please, if you get something from it, share it out to others. And if you have not, go over, support us at ldcanada.substack.com, and we will see you soon. God bless you all.
Well, friends, it is a tremendous pleasure and a privilege for me to welcome on this very special 350th and my final episode of Liberty Dispatch, Douglas Wilson. Pastor Doug is the pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, but you know that if you follow our show. He has served there for over 40 years. He's also written a number of books on cultural issues and blogs at dougwills.com. He and his wife, Nancy, have 3 kids, 18 grandkids, and 5 great-grandkids with whom they have a lot of fun. Pastor Doug, I really am thankful that you took the time to join us today. I'm anticipating a fun and sarcastic kind of conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Happy to do it. Thank you for the invite.
So, Pastor Doug, we have talked a little bit, not only in interview form, but outside of that. There's been growing discussions about this movement on the far right, if you will, the Dank Right, as you've called them, the young, restless, and red-pilled, as we've called them on our show. And it's the sort of thing where I was watching James White talk about this, where it seems that it sprung up out of nowhere, that it wasn't particularly on many people's radars, at least is not a concern. I mean, 10 years ago, Nick Fuentes was just some crazy anti-Semite that had weird views, and, Ben Shapiro dealt handily with him. But now it looks like that's not actually the case. It looks like their popularity is as big as it's ever been and has actually eclipsed several of their critics. I'm thinking of the Daily Wire, for example. So I wanted to get your thoughts on where this came from, or why is it that seemingly it's like it's popped up out of nowhere when we know that's not the case. Something was brewing. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on the genesis of this whole far, far Nazi sympathetic Dank Right movement that has really bloomed in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So first, I think there really is a development of that nature on the right. I've talked to people who are affected by online personalities and podcasters and whatnot. There is a there, and there's a reason for pastors to be concerned and to address it. At the same time, I was just looking at a couple of news stories this morning. This is broken over the last few days, where a deep dive analysis of Nick Fuentes' followers indicated that much of his support has been artificially inflated by overseas bots, basically. This ties in with something I've warned about and cautioned about from the very beginning of the rise of the Dank Right people. And that is, I'm not saying, let's say there's a goat Joe Schmo, going on about the Jews and blacks and all of that stuff. And I would say to him, okay, I'm not saying you're a Fed. I don't know that you're a Fed. But if you were a Fed, would you be behaving any differently? Right? In other words, I think a lot of the megaphone that the Dank Right has been given is an op. So I don't think the Dank Right itself is an op. I think there are real people who really have these problems wound tight around their axle. But I think the prominence, the influence, the traffic, the numbers, the views, I think that's an op.
So is the goal to get us to take the bait, as you've said before? Is the goal in the same way that they had alleged undercover FBI agents on January 6th in order to drum up this kind of excitement and this hatred, in order that the response then gives the state what it wants, which is essentially to crack down as tyrants?
Yeah, I think this is all part of the same thing. This is an attempt to destabilize and discredit the conservative resistance to the deep state. So the feds who are involved in the J6 thing, what they were wanting to do is to get an overreaction against the establishment that they could have justification for cracking down on. All right. I think this op is a little bit different in that it's let's you and him fight. So this is designed to get conservatives fighting with one another, which has erupted in the last few years.
It's been very successful in the last month, especially.
Correct. It's been a very successful op. Nick Fuentes, Candace, all of this stuff has gotten Christians and Christian conservatives going at one another. Now, the people who really are twisted, I think Nick Fuentes himself is a mess, and I don't mind going after him, but he's influencing people that are not in the same place spiritually where he is. And there are good people who believe what Candace is saying, or who are swayed by it and upset by it. I don't know what to think anymore. That kind of thing. And I think this as an op has been strikingly successful. That doesn't mean that it's all smoke and mirrors. There really is a there that has to be addressed, but I don't think we should set our hair on fire.
So what would be, in your estimation, the right play for, let's speak primarily to whether it's pastors, elders, leaders in churches, like men whose responsibility it is to disciple other men, to come alongside them in various men's ministries or whatever the context might be. What is the play? What is the sort of thing that we need to be doing? How do we disciple them? How do we direct them? Like, what is our response? Again, maybe not so much to the op, because we're going to let that play out. We don't have control over what bots do overseas, but specifically those men who are falling victim to this ideology, who are starting to say really wild things in the same way that, these are the same sort of people during the height of the COVID madness that all of a sudden became flat earth and there's microchips in the jabs and Obama's a lizard person. Like, how do we respond to these men who are starting to believe some pretty destructive, very evil anti-Christian ideologies and ideas?
Right. I would say to them, pastorally, speaking to them as a pastor, I would say your duties are in front of you. And no, I'm not talking about your screen and keyboard. Your duties are in front of you. Get offline. And I'm not talking about total abstinence, but stop doom scrolling. Just stop doom scrolling and go read Hop on Pop to your kid. Okay.
I'm glad you picked one of the Dr. Seuss books that's not been canceled, by the way. That's very wise of you.
Yes. I don't want to get in trouble. And you might say, well, I don't have a kid. And I say, well, there's the second problem.
Right.
Well, I'm not married. Well, there's the third problem. Yeah. You go find a cute girl, ask her, get married, have a kid, and then read Hop on Pop to that kid. Basically, what we need in destabilized times like this is an ecclesiastical version of touching grass. Mm-hmm. Right? What we need is Christian community in 3 dimensions, where we know one another, we borrow one another's lawnmowers, we watch one another's kids, we educate them together in the Christian school, we worship together on the Lord's Day. True, robust community is the answer to all the smoke and mirrors that is going on in the shimmering world of political controversy. Some of which is real controversy, much of which is artificially generated.
So essentially what you're saying is that the answer is the same answer that we would have given 5 years ago in the light of this madness, which has always been the answer, but there's something about a culture turning even more anti-Christian where we have to be even clearer about the answer and the solution to the problem.
Absolutely, yes.
So in the spiritual realm, you raise a point about these men, and this is something when I was watching the interview with Tucker and Nick, I saw a young man who you could see there was a disparaging of marriage, right? That's definitely a mark of this movement, is that we don't get married. And they give their reasons, because women are going to divorce you, take half of all you own. Like, they have their excuses, but they clearly disparage marriage. They play a weird kind of male victim card. There's also a little bit of, I think, a real bit of misogyny in them, and a hatred of women to a certain extent, and a perpetual boyhood. In the spiritual realm, what's the connection? So these are marks of this movement, these young disaffected men, and we would say the answer is, well, if you want to become a not young disaffected man, get married, have kids, be responsible. Right. In the spiritual realm, what is it that's been driving it the other way? Like, let's get out of the merely what they're saying with their mouths, but what's been the spiritual play moving it in that direction? And then what's the consequence as well of having men think this way about marriage, about sexuality, about children? What does that do then?
If I had to summarize all that negativity, incelness, misogyny, all of that stuff, I would summarize it with one word called fatherlessness. We're talking about fatherlessness. And the answer is to read Hop on Pop to your kids. The answer is fathers. And this is one of the places where feminism has been most corrosive, where fatherhood is a dirty word, submission is a dirty word, authority is a dirty word, but you can't have fathers without authority, and you can't have authority without fathers. And what we want is good fathers, right? We don't want domesticated fathers. We don't want long-housed fathers. We want true biblical Christian fathers, and that is the antidote for what ails us. That is the thing that we need, and so consequently, we need to stop. Basically, a lot of these guys online remind me of child soldiers. Where they're at war, and sometimes they're fighting the right enemy. They're going after the left and the progressive left, but it's an army of 12-year-olds captained by 14-year-olds with automatic weapons, and it's just tragic. And so one of the things that we've seen in the recent vitriol eruption over the last 5 years has been hostility to boomers. Okay, which is another way of saying hostility to fathers. Right now, just so that I was just reading the other day the first 8 verses of Psalm 78, where the first verses begin. We what we've heard from our fathers, we want to pass on to our children and teach them. And you've got this wonderful generational succession. But the reason you teach to these things to your children and they to their children is so that they would not be like their fathers. Right? So I'm more than prepared to acknowledge that my generation, the boomer generation, invented the rebellion that led to the sexual revolution that created a big chunk of this mess, right? But the antithesis is not generational. What happens? It's not like the good guys are below a certain age and the bad guys above a certain age. Again, my generation taught never trust anyone over 30. Wisdom resides with youth.
Well, because that's a woke way of thinking, right? That's thinking in woke categories. It's putting people into their classes or their groups or identity groups and not seeing them as individuals, which is we would say, a leftist tactic historically, and yet here it's being deployed on the quote-unquote political right.
Right. And that's exactly what's happening. So people don't make distinctions. So I was there in the 70s. I was there in the 70s and the 80s when the culture wars were first taking shape. And there were many Christians in my generation who formed the initial core of the resistance to this progressive left. And of course, my generation led the way in this progressive nonsense. So, in other words, people of my generation were good guys and bad guys. And the fight with, but what's happening now is this class warfare mentality, the wokeness, the woke ideology, where people are condemned simply because of the group that you've associated them with. And the woke left does this by saying you're white, you're heterosexual, you're male, you're a bad guy by definition. That's why we don't need a trial. We can, the rioters can kill you, and they are well within their rights because you're a member of the oppressive class. Okay. Now, the biblical worldview wants to treat people as individuals who have group loyalties. They belong to a tribe that, they're Jew, Greek, slave, free, but they this is why Augustine talked about the Ordo Amoris, where you structure your loyalties and affections and allegiances in an appropriate way. So I have more in common with a Gen X kid who loves Jesus the way you ought to love Jesus than I do with a fellow boomer who is a radical subversive commie, right? But if you lose the ability to make those sorts of distinctions, and those people over there all bad, these people over here all good, men all bad, or the misogynists are women all bad, that kind of groupthink is really following the Marxist template.
Well, and what's interesting is what happens to people who don't fit that category, right? And interestingly enough, it's the exact same tactic. So for the wokies on the left, if you're someone like Samuel Say, who we both know, we're both friends with him, they would say that he is white adjacent, or they would say that he would be skin folk but not kinfolk. Or here's what they say to me. So I'm not a boomer. I'm 41 years old, but I've been very clear in my criticism of a lot of this strongly wild anti-Semitic red pilled nonsense. And what they'll say of me is, "Oh, but you have boomer brain," or you are imbibing a post-war consensus. And so the whole thing falls apart, because then when you pick up the people who don't fit the category, whether it's young people who don't buy in one case, or black people who don't buy in, then they say, well, now we can change the rules altogether and we can just say you're an Oreo, or you're old on the inside, or whatever they want to say. It's totally ridiculous.
That's totally ridiculous. And that is the people are in the grip of ideology. They've become ideologues instead of Christians who embrace the creeds, embrace historic Christianity.
Yeah. So I want you to, I'd like you to maybe make the trail a little more distinct between fatherlessness and what we see. So I know you know what that is. I know you've even seen it in your pastoral experience. I know I've seen it. I've seen in the lives of people I know, and I see where God, personally has been gracious to me. My dad left when I was younger. He wasn't a particularly good dad, but I saw how the Lord brought in good older men to take that place. Make that, kind of draw that out. So what we're seeing with some of these men and their view of women, or their view of sexuality, or their view of unhinged skepticism, what is it about not having a dad around that leads to these problems? Kind of draw that out for our audience, because they might not, they see the two points. Maybe they don't see how one necessarily leads to the other. Can you draw that out so we can have a clear picture?
All kids, boys and girls both, want their father's approval. They want this is my beloved son, with whom I'm well pleased. When Jesus was baptized at the Jordan, we have there the quintessential father-son moment. The father is there. He speaks. He communicates. His pleasure in his son. That's the way, that's the template. That's the model of how fathers ought to be with their sons, their children, all of the boys and girls both. But daughters are looking to their dads to see what kind of man they should marry, and sons are looking to their dads to see what kind of man they should be. Right now, when they look there and there's a vacuum, or there's some sort of radical deficiency or problem, and you don't get that paternal accolade, or you get it, but it's not worth much because because of the context and all the problems. There's an itch in your soul. There's something that's missing, and it's a pretty fundamental thing that is missing. And so consequently, the young man who has no fatherly affirmation either seeks it out in substitutes, like makeshift substitutes, where he wants the approval of the party, or the approval of the partisan ideological faction that he's part of, and he's trying to get all his affirmation from a faulty source. That's not true fatherhood. It's not real fatherhood, and so it's not going to scratch that itch. Or the other thing he does is he just gives up in despair and says, "This is not a possibility. I'm never going to have it. It's not mine to have, and I'm just going to black pill and just reject the world." War on the world. And that's where you're going to get your anarchists and your Nietzscheans and the people who are just want to burn the whole thing down. So it's either patsies in the grip of an ideology that promises paternalism, the state ultimately, or it's despair and anarchy. The alternative, fathers with their own kids being true fathers, grandfathers with their kids and grandkids being true grandfathers, pastors and elders being true fathers in the church. It is, and this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't have women leading the singing and doing the scripture reading and all the things up front except for the sermon. There are complementarian churches that are basically soft they're left-wing egalitarians, right? They've got this arbitrary verse in the Bible that keeps women out of the pulpit for now, but they've got women doing all sorts of things. But what the people need is the voice of fathers. Right. They need a voice of authority that reassures, that secures them. This is going to be all right. I'm with you. I'm not ditching. I'm not leaving. It's the voice of a shepherd. It's the voice of a pastor. And that is the alternative world that we have to rebuild. There is no security apart from patriarchy.
So I want to ask you a little bit about Christian nationalism, but before we kind of make that turn, I have one last question. And as I've been seeing what's happening over the last 5 years, as the medical industrial complex and as the civil government, as the mask, no pun intended, that's covered their face has been ripped off, and now we see that rather than being civil servants, we have people that are serving themselves, that there's an amassing of power and wealth and incredible exchange of money. And often it's at the expense of the people that they have been elected to serve. They're not doing their duty at all. So I've seen that shift happen. And one of the things I've seen in people is now they're saying, okay, we can't trust anything. We've been lied to about everything. It's all an unhinged skepticism. And then these men are now slowly making their drift toward, let's say, conservatism. And my concern is, and this is what we've seen in the last, couple years, is they're flying right past biblical conservatism into the arms of the Dank Right. And so maybe not so much for the pastor, for the elder, but speak to the everyday guy who goes to a church, he loves his family, and he sees his friends, he sees other people, and they're making this journey that they are working from, let's say, we got to deal with the paradigm, but they're working from a more kind of center, moderate position. They've been awoken to the reality of what's really going on in the spiritual realm and among our elites and institutions. And now they're beginning their march to the right, and we need to snatch them before they fly right past us into a dangerous place. What do we say to those guys who are seeing their friends and family members and brothers move in this direction, but they might not have a platform or a pulpit or the ability to address it publicly or with that kind of authority that some have? How do we encourage these men to quite literally save their brothers from going way off the cliff?
Yeah. I think you've described the situation quite nicely, because what's happening is people are leaving the progressive left and they're driving right by. There are millions of evangelical Christians in this country, millions of them, and so why are they driving right by these biblical conservatives on the freeway to drive off to the Dank Right? Well, it's because in our stretch of the highway, we have refused to put any signs up. There are no exit signs. Because what happens is that you've got all these pastors who, many of them are very conservative in their cultural expectations. They really are conservative, but they've been taught to detach it from and not talk about, basically submerge it. That's private. You can be conservative and it's private, and the church is just about the gospel, narrowly considered. And so you have the gospel-centered movement. Well, the problem with being gospel-centered is not where the center is, because the gospel should be central. The issue is where the circumference is. When you say the gospel is central, I'd say central to what? Well, it's central to all of life, and that includes politics. That includes culture. So the model for this would be Charlie Kirk. Okay, he was a person who was not shy at all about his Christian convictions, and he wasn't shy at all in the same Q&A session in talking about immigration or the various political issues. He talked about them all together, and that was worldview thinking. That was a worldview Christian approach. and it was radically successful, so successful that he had to be taken out. Okay, so if you don't want these young men driving by your stretch of the highway and going on to the abyss, then put up some signs. There's worldview Christianity here. We will teach you how to marry, how to have kids. We will talk to you about how to think like a Christian citizen. We will talk to you about being a churchman. We want to fit you out for life, right? And we're not going to be shy about tackling certain subjects. And I think one of the blessings that has come out of the Charlie Kirk murder is that many pastors and Christian leaders have come to realize that there's no law against doing what Charlie Kirk was doing. Let's talk about all the things.
Yeah, so let's talk about one of those things, and I'm glad you brought up Charlie Kirk, because the reality of Christian nationalism, right? So in the height of the COVID madness, in response to what was going on, here you had Christians and groups of people saying what we need to do to be ready for the days and years ahead is we need to start Christian classical schools. We need to build businesses. We need to plant churches. We need to train pastors. We need to engage. And we kind of had this idea of a Christian nationalism, which was, in my estimation, properly defined, a good thing. That yes, we want biblical principles to be infused in and influence every sphere of society. We want legislators making good laws based on God's law. We want businesses operating according to biblical principles. We want schools teaching from a biblical worldview. We want all of that. But what we've seen in the last little bit is it looks like the label, rather than being kind of used as a bludgeoning tool against us, Christian nationalism is synonymous with fascist and alt-right. And we've been saying, no, that's not us. Well, it turns out now there are those actual people who are also claiming the title Christian nationalism, and they're taking it to they're the people that we're trying to save people from going past us into that camp. Do you think, in light of, let's say, how the term is now being used, or who's kind of taken the term and really how it's understood by most people, combined with maybe some of the historical baggage that comes with nationalism, do you think that we are at a place, or we're soon coming to a place where maybe it's time to shed off the Christian nationalist title and maybe embrace or move towards something else? Or do you think, no, we can still, there's still something redeemable here. We can still work with this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I've said all along that if Christian nationalism comes to mean Nick Fuentes, and Time magazine makes him the Christian nationalist of the year, and he's on the cover, and the fighting over the legitimacy of the term and who owns the term, if that's over, I'm not going to hang on to Christian nationalism. I'm going to say fair with whatever it meant at one point in my advocacy of it. It doesn't mean that now. And so I'm going to find another name for what I'm doing, even though what I would be doing would be the same thing. Oh, okay. I'm not going to clutch at the term just out of an arbitrary cussedness or stubbornness. That said, I still think it's an open question, because in the providence of God and by God's grace, I am the most well-known Christian pastor, Christian nationalist currently. Okay, so there are others who are doing their thing, podcasters who are doing their thing, but CNN and Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and when those guys want to get a comment from a Christian nationalist pastor spokesman, I get a call.
Go to Voldemort. That's who they go to.
Yes.
And apparently now, I remember you saying this, apparently now your name can be said. We can invoke the name of Doug Wilson, and it's okay now. We don't have to worry about some evil spell being cast upon us.
Right. Not only so, but I am now the moderate, which is kind of disorienting for me. But basically, I think that the battle over the term is still a hot one and ongoing. If I lose the battle, then so be it. But right now, it's pretty good. So things are looking pretty good. Andrew Torba of Gab just recently put a big, long thing together on what is Christian nationalism. And then he, in the resources, the first resource that he listed was the Stone Choir podcast, which is a neo-Nazi thing, right? And okay, I'm not that kind of Christian nationalist. But he had all these resources and publishers and people and that sort of thing. But he left us out. All right. We weren't on the we weren't on the list. So he was more comfortable with listing avowed neo-Nazis than he was comfortable listing conservative Presbyterians. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're a boomer. That's why, because you're now the problem in that
Yes.
you've imbibed a post-war consensus, and you're Rabbi Doug. You're doing the work for the Zionists. At least that's how they label it, which is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the categories we were talking about before. It's just putting people in groups.
It's astonishing how much I've transformed in my convictions without moving at all.
Yeah, exactly. You've become that meme. Doug, so I'm very interested. Sorry, Johnny come lately, better late than never. It's been one of those days. Anyways, I'm interested in where you guys are at in the conversation, because this was a question that I wanted to put to you, Doug, because you're talking about, okay, worldview Christianity. You're a Christian nationalist as it pertains to the relationship between the church and state, and Christians and the state. And you're a worldview Christian. You think in wholes, not parts, right? You've heard Francis Schaeffer calling in the wilderness. You've answered his call. I want to be a whole Bible, whole worldview Christian. So when you're using the term Christian nationalism, that's in the context of this full-orbed Christian world and life view. My concern is the men who are glomming onto that title, all they really care about is one's relationship to the state. So they're almost the mirror opposite of the leftists, right? They're falling into that status dialectic that they believe that in our current cultural circumstances, the only way that we get out of clown world is by using the state.
We need a Franco. We need these guys. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's where not only am I question the history of the label nationalism. I don't think it's rooted. It's not our label. It's not Christian, grounded in Christianity. It's, something that comes out of romanticism. I think it's been problematic. But I understand how you're using it, and I consent to what you're maybe trying to take the label. My concern, though, is it's focusing the conversation primarily on one's relationship to the state. And it's for these guys, it's playing into this kind of neurosis that's all they're really concerned about. And almost a term like Christian dominionism or covenant. I know covenant's been used a lot, but covenantalism, that forces us to say, oh, the state is actually only one institution in the world that God's created. And it's important that we understand how we relate to it, but it's not good enough to only talk about how one relates to the state. So I just want to ask you, do we need to change that focus? And do we really need to emphasize a whole Christian worldview that includes sphere sovereignty, although maybe they think that's just a part of the post-war consensus or whatever? That's what I'm interested to get your take on, Doug.
Yeah. So I would just draw a distinction between a Christian nationalist, as I'm defining it, and a nationalist Christian. All right. Right. So
helpful.
If you're looking to the state first and you want the strong man, you want, it's either quasi-fascist or we want a man to rise up to deliver us. We need a strong king like the other nations round about. That is a road to disaster. And granted, I'm using Christian nationalist the same way I would say Christian husband or Christian father or Christian churchman. The adjective Christian is that which is intended to pervade the whole, right? So I'm a citizen of a nation now, and I'm a Christian. I love my country, and I have ultimate allegiance to Jesus Christ. So my version of Christian nationalism simply says I think America should stop making God angry. That's that's and is that so wrong? Now, if someone says, if they sort of truncate it, and they want to be a groiper in the basement, online, terminally online, talking about America or America, and that's all they talk about, and they're not married, they don't have kids, they're not plugged into a church, they don't have any participation in Christian community, then that approach is diseased. It really is diseased. Now, I am a covenanter, right? I believe that America is still under the Solemn League and Covenant, actually. And I wrote was that, as is Canada, as Michael Wagner's book, the title escaped. Yeah, I'm completely there. I wrote an article decades ago for Antithesis magazine arguing the same point, that we are still covenantally bound. So I'm a covenanter, but when I get interviewed and when people talk to me, I'm described as a Christian nationalist, but I'm also described as a Calvinist, Presbyterian. I'm also, and I have no hesitancy being described as a covenanter, right? I think or a worldview Kuyperian. I think all of those things have to go into this mix, because our tagline here in Moscow is all of Christ for all of life. And that means if it's all of Christ for all of politics and then we stop, then it's lopsided. It's going to come back and bite you.
Mm-hmm. How familiar are you with, I'm curious to know what's happening in Canada specifically. Are you familiar at all with Bill C-9? Have you heard the
Yes,
murmurings of this?
Yeah. C-9, yes, I have. And it just escaped me. There was this is the one that puts restrictions on, C4 was the
C4 was the conversion
sexuality.
therapy legislation.
Yeah.
C9 is the one.
Is hate crimes, hate thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Where basically so up until this point, there is existing hate speech legislation, which itself is problematic. But currently in our criminal code, there are exemptions to hate speech if the hate speech is seen as a quote unquote good faith belief that is grounded in a religious text and tied to deeply held religious conviction. So if I were to say something like men shouldn't engage in sodomy with other men, God thinks that's evil, and he says that that's evil. And, that's hate speech. However you define hate speech is irrelevant. What I know is that my deeply held religious convictions that are grounded in my religious text, which are historic, make me make that good faith argument. I'm not calling for that person to be stoned, and I'm certainly not going to engage in that. So that protection exists. So Bill C-9 is looking to remove those protections as well, and have the hate speech without the exemption. So you've been observing,
as well as, Andrew, don't forget taking away Attorney General approval for the invocation of the hate speech law. So that will happen from non-legal experts and professionals at the local level with the local RCMP or police. They will be able to make that judgment, and it will not have to go through the courts. So it will ramp up the amount of hate speech prosecutions that happen, potentially 100-fold.
So you've seen what the happenings in Canada from a distance over the last 5-6 years. You've seen the tyranny, the lockdowns, the legislation. And you've been watching it from Idaho, but also obviously connected with very many Canadians. You're connected with mutual friends of ours. Right. You're a fellow at the Ezra Institute. So as you've been seeing all this happen, as you've been seeing the trajectory of Canada, which is different than the States in that our individual provinces don't have the same kind of autonomy or sovereignty that states do. So this is happening here. and the majority of our audience is also Canadian. So as someone who's been seeing this happen, who has his finger on the pulse of things culturally, as you've been able to see trends unfold over decades, both decades ago, but seeing what has happened in the last little bit, I guess, what would be your pastoral brotherly encouragement to Canadians here who are thinking, I'm doing all the things you're talking about. So I'm doing those things. I'm getting married. I'm having kids. We're doing the classical education. We're doing the businesses. We're loving our kids well. We're not being dependent on the state. And yet it's becoming increasingly difficult to be a believer, and it's becoming more dangerous, even in the eyes of the law. But they're saying, but this is home. This is where we are. How would you encourage them? What would be some maybe practical or even kind of spiritual principles you would say to them, brother, here's how you need to think about your engagement in the next 10, 20, 30 years,
Right.
for things getting worse?
Yeah, things are getting worse. It is, I describe that state of affairs as totalitarians. And basically where the UK is now, sentencing people for absurd things, is headed to Canada's next. And the same forces are at work in our blue cities and states. It's a radical disease that is spreading through the West. All right, and so the first thing I would say to the Canadian Christians who are fighting the good fight, doing what they need to do, they're in a good church, they're loving their kids, homeschooling their kids, they're doing what they need to do. I would say first, in the first place, do not grow weary in doing good. Okay. You're late in 1 Corinthians 15:58, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So you're offering what you're doing up to God for God to dispose of as he sees fit. So don't you get discouraged in all the day-to-day things that you're doing. That's number one. Number two, to the extent that you're geopolitically engaged, pray for the secession of Alberta.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if the cause of the secession is oil. That doesn't matter, because one of the things that we want to do is give the statists other things to think about. So, for example, the Canadian truckers thing was glorious, and it although it didn't in the final analysis succeed, it succeeded in one thing. It showed me that there is a deep vein of potential resistance in Canada to tyranny. Right, the old ways are not completely forgotten. The old freedoms are not completely forgotten. There are a lot of people who resonated with that, and the establishment knew which levers to pull and how to manipulate it and so forth, and they did that. But the secession of a province, of a rich province, of an oil producing province, would divide Canada in two. It would give refugees a place to flee to. It would create opportunities for conservative Christians who happen to agree about the oil thing, but that's not the big deal. The big deal is they want to start a Christian school. That's the big deal. It would give them a place to go to. So the American War for Independence was basically a joint effort between evangelicals and smugglers. There were the smugglers, the free market guys on the one hand, and the people who were concerned about traditional Christian moral values, and they came together, and it was potent. So basically, I would pray for things to erupt that the statists have not budgeted for, that they've not planned for. They don't have anything in their kitty that would answer that. Basically, pray for a black swan event to hit Canada that would create all kinds of glorious opportunity.
Canada, we would call it a black
Mm.
goose event. I think it would be fair to call it a black goose event. Would be more
Except they're
appropriate
all
up here.
black.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that is actually like really, helpful, thoughtful, practical thought. And it says you've talked about like we shouldn't lose hope in these moments because God loves, like our religion is based off of a man who rose from the dead, and he loves near death stories. And Canada, it looks like, is very close to dead. And
Yeah.
if I know the story well enough, this is when God loves to act in amazing ways.
As I put it, God loves cliffhangers.
Yeah,
He tells
exactly.
he tells them all the time, and basically we just need to trust him in the fray.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good word, right? Like all the stuff that you guys have been talking about that Christians have to do, and that Doug, you've spent most of your ministry talking about Christians having to do, are things that, regardless if God grants miraculous repentance to our nation, or if our nation crashes and burns, these are the very things that form a culture that will either rise from the ashes or that will be the jumping off point for a reformation, right? So, like you say, Doug, our labors are not at all in vain in doing those very important things.
Amen.
Yeah. Doug, before we let you go, I have one question. I've been watching a lot of those interviews that you talked about with various men. Ross Douthat, he asked you a very interesting question before he let you go. And he said, Doug, okay, you're having fun, you're doing your thing out in Moscow. My concern, though, Doug, is you Calvinists. You tend to build the greatest, most flourishing societies. It's awesome. Sure, I'll give you that, but it lasts one generation and then it's gone. And that, maybe there's a lesson in that. Now that you've had time to think of that, what would you say to that? Because I was thinking to myself, couldn't you literally say that exact same thing against Israel in the Bible? They build flourishing societies, then it seems like in one generation, it all goes to pot.
Right.
Does that not argument not prove too much and ultimately wags the finger at God? But also, what in your mind, what is something that maybe Calvinists haven't got right in their cultural reformations that we've seen that this time we need to consider and do better?
Yeah. So first, I think you put your finger on it. This is not a peculiar Calvinist thing. This is a people thing. This is something that people do. It happens in families. Granddad makes a fortune because he's got a hard work ethic. Cotton Mather said, "Faithfulness begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother." Someone said that the Puritans came to America to do good and ended up doing well. And so that's in Deuteronomy. Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked, right? So basically what it boils down to is that faithful obedience to God's requirements enables you to prosper. And when you prosper, you gain wealth. And when you gain wealth, you become tempted to become self-sufficient, and down the drain it goes. But that's something that's sort of characteristic of people. Now, having said that, that is a temptation, and it's a temptation that Calvinists have succumbed to at various times. At the same time, the Reformation built a very great civilization, and it didn't last just one generation. All right, so if you the Reformers, Luther, Calvin, the Reformers in Geneva, particularly John Knox in Scotland, and the forms that were established there exported small R Republican forms of governance to the New World. We still today are the beneficiaries of these Calvinist structures of government. It has been a long time eroding those things, and it's not entirely gone yet. The reason we're even able to mount any kind of resistance at all is because we went down the basement and found the armory that our Calvinist forefathers left for us. So basically, I would say he had a point, Ross had a point, but it was not as devastating a point as he thought. I'm just a very grateful son of the Puritans.
Yeah, amen. Amen, brother. Well, we're so appreciative of all that you've done and continue to do to help Christians think in worldview wholes, in those terms, to help give us all the mining you've done of those old resources. Help us give that armament, those weapons in waging the spiritual warfare. And I'm thankful that you've been in God's providence, been given such a platform to engage with these thoughts, to put forward your idea of a thoroughly biblical future, not only as it pertains to our relationship to the state, but of the whole of life, and all of Christ for all of life. I will put in description below. I saw you in Southern Ontario just recently with the Cantero Institute. You had a fantastic speech on what gospel-centeredness ought to mean. And I think that will be very helpful for everybody to listen, and I would say take notes and pay attention. So we'll have that in the description below, because that is, I think, the antidote to a lot of the truncated view of culture, society, and the state that we have right now. So appreciate you, Doug, for coming on and
thanks so much
for giving
Pastor
us
Doug.
your wisdom.
Really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you. Had a good time.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.